The first thing that struck me was the wax. Two tall candlesticks on the dining room table, white, unscented, half-melted, frozen in mid-drip. The wine glasses were still half full. The bed had been turned down like someone planned to sleep there but never did. Their car was gone, but their phones, wallets, and clothes were all still inside. It looked like they'd just stepped out for air, and then never came back. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and if stories like this ever touched your town, your family, or your life, hit that like and subscribe. Every click helps keep the lost from slipping further into silence. I'm Dana Whitlow. Back in 1998, I'd just turned 47 and had been with the Austin Police Department for over 2 decades. Long enough to think I'd seen just about everything: gang cases, fraud, homicide, even the occasional disappearing act. But nothing like the Trammels. They lived in a neighborhood called Cherrywood Hills, the kind of place where folks waved from their driveways, and local dogs knew which lawns not to step on. Big iron gates, golf carts, summer parties with those wide, lazy string lights. The Trammels' place sat at the very top of the hill. Long white porch French windows and hedges trimmed tight as a military cut. From the outside, everything about their life looked deliberate, controlled, beautiful even. He was a dentist who'd built his practice into a real estate empire. She ran a private art gallery out of a space on South Congress. They didn't have children, but they had presence, the kind that made neighbors talk in low tones, always admiring, sometimes jealous. I never met them in person, not until they were already gone. What I knew came secondhand from housekeepers, landscapers, neighbors who walked their golden retrievers past the driveway. Everyone said the same thing. They were kind but private, well-dressed always. Seemed like they had it all. But looking back, there were hints, little things. A house alarm that sometimes didn't arm right, packages piling up longer than usual, lights on in rooms nobody used. One neighbor, an elderly woman from 2 doors down, said she'd noticed Laurel sitting in her car at night, not going anywhere, just parked with the engine running. She'd waved once. Laurel didn't wave back. None of it seemed urgent at the time, just odd. Then came the call. It was Laurel's mother. Said she hadn't heard from her daughter in 2 days. Tried the house, got no answer. Tried the office, nothing. Said Laurel never did that, not without saying something first. I told her we'd send someone to check. The first officer arrived just after noon. Gate was unlocked. Front door slightly open. Alarm disarmed. And inside, the wine glasses. The handbag still zipped open on the kitchen island. 2 plates set out. Candles mid-drip. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned chairs. Just stillness. Like a story paused halfway through the telling. Their Mercedes was gone. But everything else, it was all exactly where it should have been. And somehow that made it worse. I remember the way the light fell through the Trammels' foyer windows that day, clear, quiet, flat. It didn't feel like a crime scene. It felt like a house waiting for someone to come home. The responding officer had called me straight from the driveway. Something about the way the table was set, the front door unlocked, the purse still sitting out. Not ransacked, not violent. Just unfinished. I parked on the street and walked up past the hedges. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass. The only thing out of place was that nothing was out of place. The wine had turned sour in the glasses. The alarm system was disarmed. The bed upstairs was turned down like it always was, with hospital corners, and a throw pillow placed just so, but neither side had been slept in. Laurel's handbag still sat on the kitchen counter, the zipper half open with a lipstick tube and receipt sticking out. Her keys were inside. So were her sunglasses. Everything that made up a life untouched. Richard's office was the same desk, tidy phone on the charger drawer locked. I opened the fridge and there were 2 portions of salmon in butcher paper thawing in a glass dish like they were planning to cook later. There was no blood. No signs of a struggle. No mess. And no Richard or Laurel. I called it in. We did our usual, checked local hospitals, jails, towing logs. Nothing. We ran the plate on their Mercedes. It hadn't been flagged, hadn't been seen. Neighbors came forward, most of them with nothing new to offer. One couple remembered seeing Laurel walking near the mailbox late the night before, robe on, barefoot. They thought maybe she'd forgotten to bring the trash bin in, didn't think much of it. Another man said he passed the Trammell's car leaving the neighborhood around 10 p.m. But he couldn't say who was driving. The housekeeper, a woman named Marta, who'd been with them for years, said everything was normal when she left that afternoon. She'd vacuumed, folded laundry, left their dinner out on the counter like always. She said Laurel was on the phone in her office laughing about a painting that had just sold. She never saw Richard. That didn't strike her as unusual. We kept circling the basics: travel plans, number, medical issues. None we knew of. Laurel's mother told us she'd spoken to her daughter almost daily and hadn't heard a word about trouble. She'd tried calling the night before and again that morning, which is what finally pushed her to report it. By day 3, we issued a bolo on the car. By day 5, flyers were going up around the city. Their faces looked too perfect on the paper, glossy, professionally taken, the kind of portrait you see in a business magazine. Not like missing persons. More like a couple on a real estate billboard. We pulled credit reports. Nothing new. No activity on any of their cards since the day they vanished. Phones went straight to voicemail. We checked airports, border crossings, train stations. All dead ends. On the 8th day, the case started getting press. Local first, then statewide. It was the kind of story that stuck. A wealthy couple, no enemies, no known vices, no history of violence. Their absence was louder than anything we could prove. Rumors started rolling in. Debt, affairs, a possible investment deal gone wrong. Most of it was speculation. People love to project a mystery onto something clean, but nothing stuck. Weeks passed. The holidays came and went. We did another full canvass of the property line, drones, dogs, infrared, the works. The backyard was landscaped tight and backed up to a stretch of greenbelt that led into some undeveloped trails. We searched every foot. Still nothing. Then in mid-January, someone called in a vehicle matching the Trammell's description. A silver Mercedes found just off a rural service road near Blanco, about 40 miles south of Austin. It had been sitting there long enough to gather a thick coat of dust with pine needles scattered across the hood and windshield. The sunroof had cracked open from heat expansion, and rain had leaked in, mottling the leather seats. The keys were still in the ignition. When I got to the tow yard, the car was already on the lot, parked behind the chain-link fence. It didn't look like a crash scene. Tires were intact, no dents, no glass broken. The doors were unlocked. On the floor mat of the passenger side, there was a dark stain. I didn't want to assume anything, but it looked like blood. Not a lot, but enough to raise concern. Forensics would later confirm it was blood. 2 sets of DNA, but neither matched Richard or Laurel. We didn't know that yet. There was something else. A receipt tucked under the front seat, dated 3 days after the Trammells had supposedly vanished. Gas station, Austin address, paid in cash, which meant either someone was using their car after the fact, or they'd been alive longer than we thought. The VIN number matched their registration, no signs of tampering, but when we checked the glove box, we found something strange. Insurance cards under the name Marcus DeWitt, a name we hadn't seen tied to either of them. No hits in our local databases. I bagged the receipt and sent it to the lab. There was a small scratch on the dashboard, looked like a single letter C carved with something sharp. Not deep, but intentional. That's when the case stopped being a disappearance and started bending towards something else. Not a robbery, not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It felt staged, like someone was trying to send a message or create a narrative. We went back to the Trammell house, this time with crime scene techs and a wider warrant. I stood in their kitchen again, staring at those wine glasses. They were cloudy now, One had a lipstick mark on the rim. The candlesticks still sat on the table, wax frozen just like before. We opened drawers, checked behind baseboards, pulled out desk cabinets. In Laurel's study, we found a folder of credit card statements. Most matched their usual spending: restaurants, gallery purchases, groceries from the co-op. But tucked toward the back were a few receipts from out of state. Boutique hotels, art supply stores, all in New Mexico. Dates ranged from late September to early October, just before they vanished. All charged to Laurel. But when I looked at the signature lines, each one was slightly different. Same name, different handwriting. One neat, one angled, one almost rushed. Someone was either forging her purchases, or Laurel herself was using different handwriting on purpose. Back at the precinct, I handed the receipts to my partner, Steve Alton. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Why go all the way to New Mexico and pay cash for art when you live in a house like that?" I didn't have an answer, but I kept thinking about the initials on the dashboard, the mismatch of names, the blood that didn't belong, the timeline that had quietly stretched past the night we thought everything ended. And then the lab called. They'd found something. In the glove box, behind the registration, tucked flat under the lining, was a photocopy of a lease agreement. Not for anything in Texas. A small property outside Santa Fe. Leased under the name Marcus DeWitt. No cosigner. Paid in full. Dated 2 months before the Trammels disappeared. I stood there, holding that paper in my hand, thinking about the scratch on the dashboard. That one letter. That quiet house. That half-finished dinner. Something had come apart, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure we only saw the edges. We logged the lease agreement and added Marcus DeWitt to our list of unknowns. I remember Steve sitting across from me in the incident room, chewing on the cap of his pen eyes, locked on the timeline we'd pinned to the wall. He'd been through a dozen missing persons cases before, but I could see it in the way his brow stayed low. He didn't think this was just a walkaway. Neither did I. But it was still too soon to call it something worse. Not without a body. Not without proof. And the higher-ups didn't like opening up that word murder unless they had something they could print on paper. A few of them still believed the Trammels had staged the whole thing. Said rich people sometimes do strange things when things start to fall apart. But I'd been in that house. Laurel didn't stage anything. And if she had, she wouldn't have left her dog behind. We started pulling financials, anything tied to their names, their LLCs, their retirement accounts. Most of it looked clean on the surface. No big dumps, no last-minute wire transfers. But then Evelyn Shaw, one of our analysts in forensics, flagged something odd in the metadata from Laurel's credit file. A charge had come through from a boutique motel in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Paid in cash, but a loyalty program tied it back to a secondary profile under Laurel's social security number. The name used at check-in was Anna Vale. That made 2 aliases now, Marcus DeWitt and Anna Vale, and both of them were tied to out-of-state locations far from Cherrywood Hills. Shaw and I booked a flight the next morning. The motel was quiet squat with stucco walls and a flickering sign that read Desert Star. The office smelled like mildew and weak coffee. The man at the front desk had thinning hair and a voice like gravel. I showed him a photo of Laurel. He squinted at it for a while, then said, "Yeah, that's her. Came in with a man. Didn't give a last name. Paid in cash. Stayed 3 nights in room 12. I asked if he remembered anything strange. He shrugged. They kept to themselves. She did most of the talking. He didn't say much. Looked like maybe they were fighting the second night. Heard something through the wall. Then next morning they were gone. Didn't check out. Just left the key on the table. Room 12 sat at the end of the row. The door stuck on the way open. Inside it was bare, the sheets stripped the air stale. But in the corner wedged behind the bathroom sink, Steve found a small pill bottle. The label had been scratched off, but inside were 2 capsules. Pale blue. We bagged it. On the back of the bathroom door, just above the towel hook, someone had carved 2 letters CH. Not deep, not obvious, but it caught the light just enough to see. I traced it with my gloved finger. Laurel's initials. That's when I felt the weight shift. She had been here, and she had left something behind on purpose. Back at the Las Cruces precinct, we pulled anything tied to the name Marcus DeWitt. One old record turned up a property registration just outside Santa Fe. A small plot of land, purchased with cash in 1996. The file had been sitting in a back drawer, never followed up on. The deputy who helped us said they almost auctioned it off for unpaid taxes, but the ownership was still technically active. We borrowed a department vehicle and made the drive out. The lot sat about 20 minutes outside town. No house, no signs of construction, just a barbed wire fence and a couple weather-beaten signs half buried in dust. Steve kicked at the dirt and muttered, "What was he planning to build out here?" I didn't answer. I just walked the perimeter and let the silence sink in. It didn't feel like a development site. It felt like someone had come out here to disappear. We didn't find anything that day. But a week later, back in Austin, the results came in from the blood sample we'd pulled off the Mercedes floor mat. 2 DNA profiles. Neither belonged to Richard or Laurel. No matches in CODIS. Whoever bled in that car there were 2 of them, and they hadn't been logged in any national system. We checked with hospitals near Blanco, checked for emergency room visits, transfusions, even missing persons. Nothing. Evelyn called me into the lab late that evening. I'll never forget how calm her voice was when she said it. "Dana, this isn't their blood, and it's not a random transfer. It's fresh. It happened around the time the car was abandoned." We opened the file back up. We went over everything again, photos of the house receipts, digital footprints. That's when I noticed something in the scan of Laurel's purse we'd cataloged weeks earlier. A receipt tucked behind the inner lining. Not Texas, not New Mexico. Santa Fe again. A gallery purchase, small oil painting. Signed for in person under the name Anna Vale. Paid in cash, pickup only. I called the gallery first thing the next morning. The woman who answered was polite professional. I gave her the name, the date, the transaction number. There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "Yes, I remember her. I asked if we could come speak in person. She said she'd be available through the afternoon." Steve and I were back in New Mexico by that night. The gallery was tucked into the side of a quiet plaza, nothing flashy. No neon, no signs bigger than a brass plaque on the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and cedar. The woman behind the counter had silver hair and the kind of voice you only get from decades of calm rooms. I showed her a photo. She nodded without hesitation. "That's Anna," she said. "Elegant, soft-spoken. Carried herself like someone who didn't want to be seen but needed to be remembered." I asked if she ever came in with anyone. The woman hesitated. "Just once. A man. Tall, dark hair, quiet. He stood back while she spoke. I thought he might have been her husband, but she never introduced him. Just watched her the whole time, like he knew her better than anyone else did." We walked out of that gallery and stood in the plaza for a long while. The sun was low, casting gold across the tiles. I held the receipt in one hand, the photo in the other. I looked at Steve. They weren't running from something I said. They were already inside it. We checked back into the Desert Star and laid everything out across the bed. Names, receipts, blood types, locations, the motel key, the scratched initials, that undeveloped land in the desert. And suddenly, it hit me how little we really knew. Not just about where the Trammels had gone, but about who they'd been before they vanished. The aliases weren't accidents. The locations weren't random. Something about it felt rehearsed. Steve flipped through the receipts and stopped on one. He tapped the name Marcus DeWitt. "That's not just a fake name," he said. "It's a blueprint." He leaned back, arms folded. If they planned this, they weren't staging a disappearance. They were staging new lives. But I couldn't let go of the blood. and I couldn't explain why Laurel would leave her initials on a bathroom door in the middle of nowhere unless she wanted someone to follow, unless she didn't have a choice. That night, I sat on the edge of the motel bed with the lights off, the file open in my lap. Wind moved through the eaves, dry and restless. Somewhere past the walls of that room, something was unraveling, and we were already inside it. It was somewhere around 2 a.m. when I finally admitted I wasn't going to sleep. I sat up in the motel bed, that scratchy floral comforter kicked to the floor, and stared out the window into the dark stretch of highway beyond the parking lot. Steve had long since fallen asleep in the next room. I could hear the faint rhythm of his snoring through the adjoining wall, steady and deep, like the kind that only comes from a man whose conscience is still holding steady. Mine wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her initials looked on that bathroom door. About the silence after the front desk clerk said they'd left the key on the table. About the blood in the car and the names that didn't belong to them. The truth was, I'd started to lose the thread not in the facts, but in the people. I no longer knew who Richard and Laurel Trammell really were. I was following them through a maze where every turn looked intentional, but none of it made sense. We spent the next 2 days driving between places their aliases had touched. We went back to the gallery in Santa Fe, where the woman behind the desk remembered Laurel as Anna Vale, always paying cash, always alone. She remembered once, toward closing time, a man coming in with her tall, dark hair, quiet, watchful. She thought maybe it was a husband, but they never spoke directly, just stood near each other like something unspoken was holding them apart. Then we found the house, well, what used to be a house. Out past the edge of town on the land registered under the DeWitt alias, there wasn't much. Just cracked soil, a collapsed fence line, a couple pieces of rusted pipe poking up from the sand like broken ribs. No well. No electricity. Just silence and wind. Evelyn Shaw had sent a request for ground-penetrating radar, but we didn't wait. We walked the perimeter boots, crunching over gravel and weeds, and I kept thinking, this isn't a hiding place. It's a waiting place. That night in the motel, Steve lined up every receipt, every lease, every photo we had on the table between us. We kept trying to make a map of it, where they'd been when under which names, but it was like chasing light through smoke. For every hotel Laurel checked into alone, Richard had a matching paper trail 2 cities away. Art purchases under Anna Vale. Land acquisitions under Marcus DeWitt. And nothing to tie the 2 of them together except that one sighting in the gallery and a motel key left behind in a place no one would return to. Steve leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "You ever think maybe they weren't running together?" he asked. "Maybe they were running from each other." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure. Because when I looked at what we had, it didn't look like fear. It looked like choreography. The next morning, Evelyn called. The second DNA profile from the Mercedes had been processed through every database we had access to, still no match. But they'd found something else. Hidden in the lining of one of the fake IDs from the glove box was a slip of paper, folded into eighths. Coordinates, not an address, just numbers. When we plugged them into a map, it pointed to a canyon system about an hour west of Albuquerque. No structures, no road markers, just federal land, dry and unmonitored. Steve stared at the screen and said, "So now what, they're leaving us breadcrumbs." We drove out the same day, met up with a local ranger who agreed to guide us part of the way in. The last stretch we hiked on foot. The land was dry, quiet, just sage and heat and the kind of stillness that feels like it's watching you back. Eventually, we reached a flat rocky area near the base of a ridge. There, scratched into a sandstone wall about waist high, was a circle with a single line running through it. The same symbol we'd seen on the gallery receipt, barely noticeable in the corner, but now unmistakable. Beneath it, half buried in sand, was a box. smaller than a shoebox, newer than the rest. We opened it. Inside were photos. Richard and Laurel. Not mugshots, not surveillance. Vacation photos, somewhere in Europe, judging by the architecture behind them. A cafe, a market square. The timestamp in one corner read, July 1999. That was nearly a year after they'd disappeared. In every photo they looked casual, relaxed, almost happy. But in one taken from behind Laurel's head was turned toward the camera, and there was something in her eyes I still can't describe. Not fear, not defiance, just knowing. There was a note, too. Folded tucked under the photos, handwritten in the same looping cursive from the receipt in her purse. We are alive. But not for long. If you found this, the veil is already behind you. I remember standing there in the canyon with the wind in my ears and the paper in my hands, and for the first time I didn't feel like a detective. I felt like a witness. Steve said nothing for a long while. Then he muttered, "So they knew. They planted this. They left it on purpose." Back at the motel that night, we laid everything out again. The name The Veil came up for the first time, not from a report, not from a file, but from Laurel's own hand. We didn't know what it meant yet. Not a group, not a place, just a word. But somehow it felt heavier than anything else we'd found. Steve kept turning the note over like he expected more writing to appear. He said, "They wanted to be found, but only just enough." I didn't answer. I was watching the motel door, watching the space beneath it for shadows. The next day we started driving back toward Austin, but we hadn't made it an hour before Steve noticed the car. Black sedan, no plates on the front, hanging back about 4 car lengths. Every time we slowed down, it did too. Every exit we passed, it stayed with us. At a rest stop outside Socorro, we pulled over. The sedan didn't. It kept going. But as it passed, I looked up and saw the driver's face just briefly. A man, dark hair, sunglasses, not someone I recognized. But he looked at me like he did know me, like he was checking off a box. When we got back to Austin, I stopped sleeping. I'd wake up around 2 a.m. every night, heart-pounding, certain someone was outside. I kept a copy of the note on my kitchen table, folded once weighed down with a coffee cup. I didn't tell anyone else about the feeling, not even Steve. But I knew we weren't alone in this anymore. We weren't just investigating the trammels. We were walking the same path they had. I didn't know it yet, but we were about to find the first real proof that whatever the veil was, it didn't let people go. The next morning, I got a call from the front desk at the precinct. An envelope had arrived. No return address. Hand-delivered. Inside, sealed in a plastic sleeve, was a photograph. A Polaroid, taken from a distance. Me stepping out of the canyon 2 days earlier, the box still in my hand. On the back, someone had written a date and a word I hadn't seen before: harvest. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But I knew it wasn't over. Not even close. The Polaroid stayed in my desk drawer for exactly 1 night. I told myself it didn't mean what it looked like, that someone could have been watching from the ridge, that maybe it was just coincidence, a thrill seeker, or a trespasser playing a game. But I knew better. I looked at the date on the back. It matched the day we found the canyon box to the hour. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but neat. And that word harvest sat underlined like whoever wrote it wanted to make sure we didn't miss it. I stared at it too long, then slid it back into the sleeve and locked it away. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not that night. Not yet. Instead, I went back through the trammel files. I pulled everything we hadn't cross-checked for print residue receipts, ID laminates, passport copies, even the motel register pages we'd scanned from New Mexico. Evelyn Shaw had been quietly running secondary checks behind the scenes, looking for any anomalies in the documents that didn't come through on first pass. The next morning, she called me down to the lab. She didn't say much on the phone, just told me to come take a look. When I stepped inside, she had her gloves on and a stack of sealed bags laid out across the counter. She pointed to one. "This came from the passport cover found in the desert chest," she said. "You see anything odd?" I leaned in. The black material looked like any other forged document, cheap vinyl state seal pressed in too shallow. But under the surface, using spectral scan, she'd found indentation marks. Faint pressure from someone writing beneath it. We enhanced it digitally. The numbers came through one by one coordinates, different from the last ones. Northern Arizona. Not a town, not a house, just open space. No reason to go there unless you were following a map. We held off on going immediately. First, we needed to make sense of what we had. I asked Evelyn to go back and rescan every page from the chest, especially the receipts and IDs. She found something else that hadn't been flagged. Partial fingerprints on the inside of the jewelry box. Not Laurel's, not Richard's, and not from any known adult. They were small, smudged but consistent with multiple children under 12. At least 3 separate sets. I sat down and felt my jaw tighten. "Children?" I asked. Evelyn just nodded. "I ran them against every juvenile fingerprint database we have access to. No matches so far. But these prints aren't old. That box wasn't just holding documents. It was holding contact." That night, Steve came by the station. I pulled him into the side room and showed him the enhanced scans, the coordinates, the prints, the word written on the photo. We both sat there quiet for a long time. Then Steve looked at me and said, "This isn't just about the Trammels anymore," and he was right. Somewhere along the line, the story had shifted. It wasn't just a wealthy couple staging a disappearance. It wasn't just aliases and property fraud. It was starting to feel like a pattern. We decided to widen the search. We requested case files from missing persons units in 3 states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Children gone missing between 1993 and 1998. Specifically those who disappeared with their families. We didn't advertise what we were looking for. Just quiet, direct requests sent through internal channels. Over the next week, files started coming in. Some were thin a paragraph and a photo. Others were thick. One in particular stuck with me. A little girl named Elena Morales, 7 years old, disappeared from a rest stop near Phoenix in 1995, along with both parents. No signs of struggle. Vehicle still there. Doors unlocked. Food half-eaten. The case had gone cold within a month. No leads. No follow-up. No reason to connect it to anyone else. Until now. I pulled the photo from the file. Elena had dark hair, round cheeks, and a plastic bracelet on her wrist. The kind you buy at a swap meet, colorful beads big enough for little fingers to string together. Spelled out her name. Elena. The same name we'd found on a child's bracelet buried in the desert chest. I called the Phoenix field office and asked to speak with the original investigating officer. He'd long since retired. The Morales case had been archived for over 2 decades. We reached out to the family. Only the grandmother was still alive. Her name was Rosa Morales. She lived in a small stucco house on the south side of the city. Steve and I drove out the next morning. It was quiet, late morning sun already warming the sidewalk. She answered the door slowly, careful with the latch. When I explained who I was, her hand went to her chest and she nodded, ushering us in without a word. We sat at her kitchen table. There were photos on the fridge, a smell of beans cooking on the stove. I laid the bracelet on the table in a clear evidence pouch. She didn't even have to touch it. The moment her eyes fell on it, she broke. "That's hers," she said through her fingers. "She wore it every day." I gave it to her. Her voice cracked as she reached for a tissue. She had it when they disappeared. It was on her wrist. I asked her if she remembered anything unusual in the days before the family vanished. She shook her head. They were going north, just for a picnic. Carlos and Teresa and the baby. Carlos went to buy drinks at the vending machine. When he came back, the car was still there. But they were gone. She folded her hands and whispered, We never saw them again. When we left, Steve didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then he said, "You still think this isn't part of something bigger?" I didn't answer. We flew back to Austin that night. The desert looked different from the air, smaller, more fragile, the kind of place where people could vanish without leaving a ripple. When we landed, Evelyn had more files waiting. 2 more children, same window of years. A boy in Denver. A girl in Dallas. Same pattern. Vanished during family outings. No sign of violence, no recovery. Each case had one thing in common, a single child. Always one. Always gone. By the end of the week, we had 6 cases that fit. 6 families, 6 children, each with some small item left behind. A bracelet, a baseball cap, a sketchbook, all of them buried or hidden in proximity to the trammel's footprints. But the timelines didn't just overlap, they lined up. Every location tied to one of their aliases fell within 100 miles of a disappearance. Not once, not twice, every time. I pulled out the canyon note again. We are alive, but not for long. If you found this, the veil is already behind you. I set it beside the Polaroid, the one of me, the one that hadn't been mailed, the one that had been placed. Steve stepped into the room and dropped a folder in front of me. "You need to see this," he said. Inside were flight manifests, bookings under the DeWitt and Vail names. Always 2 tickets, all paid in cash. Dates matched the weeks after each family vanished. Destinations ranged from Mexico to the Czech Republic to Greece. We couldn't confirm passengers, but the pattern was locked in. Aliases, cash, disappearances. I leaned back and felt the room tilt. Evelyn walked in a few minutes later with one more folder. She looked pale. "I ran the latest set of fingerprints," she said. Still no match. "But we found something else." She laid out a photo, a child standing in the background of one of the trammel's early travel photos. Unlabeled, smiling, and on her wrist, barely visible, a thin band of colored beads. Steve exhaled. "That's her. That's Elena." I nodded slowly. "And she's not with her parents." Evelyn said nothing. Just stepped back, arms folded, waiting for us to catch up. I turned to the photo. Something in my chest hollowed out. They weren't just running. They weren't just watching. They were selecting. Or someone was. And whoever left that bracelet in the desert wanted us to know exactly how close they'd been. I didn't sleep that night. I left the evidence board lit thumbtacks gleaming in the dark, each thread stretching farther than the last. I kept hearing Rosa Morales' voice in the back of my mind. She wore it every day. The location tied to the new coordinates sat about 30 miles northwest of Holbrook, Arizona. Just a patch of desert scrub off a frontage road that hadn't seen pavement in 20 years. No signage, no mailbox, just a turnoff so slight you could drive past it a dozen times and never think to slow down. We waited until late afternoon before heading out, partly because we needed the satellite imagery to update, and partly because I was stalling. Something about the bracelet photo, the child standing off-center behind the trammels, had shifted things for me. Not in theory, but in weight. Seeing her smile, that easy, unknowing smile, while Richard and Laurel posed like tourists in front of an old cathedral, knocked something loose in my chest. I kept thinking about the word harvest. It felt less like a metaphor now, and more like an accounting term, a measured removal, a pattern with purpose. Steve drove. He didn't say much, just sipped gas station coffee and kept the radio low. We turned off the main highway around 6. The land opened into flat mesas and dry creek beds, then narrowed again as the road curled between low hills of sandstone. I kept the photo in my hand the whole time. When we reached the coordinates, there was nothing to see at first. No structure, no marker, just desert. But about 50 yards in, hidden behind a natural outcrop, we found a locked steel hatch set into the ground. It was flush with the dirt. Low profile, no visible rust, the kind of door you'd miss unless you knew to look for it. Steve walked the perimeter while I called it in. We requested an evidence team from Flagstaff and secured the area. The hatch was sealed with a biometric pad and an older model mechanical key slot. It looked custom-built, industrial, quiet, expensive. When the team arrived, it took nearly 2 hours to open. They had to override the lock manually, and even then the hinges screamed under the pressure. The air that came up was dry but stale, with the slight metallic edge of long, undisturbed space. The stairs led down into a square chamber about 10 by 10 lined with storage shelves and bolted cabinets. No light, no sound. The whole space was insulated like a storm bunker or a high-end panic room, but it wasn't built for weather. It was built for silence. We moved carefully. I remember Evelyn saying something behind me, something quiet, like, "Don't touch anything yet," but my eyes were already on the far wall. That's where we found them. Dozens of photographs printed on matte stock pinned in neat rows, each labeled with a name and a year. Some were of children, others were of families, but most were just of objects. A backpack, a rubber shoe, a spiral notebook with a cartoon tiger on the front. I counted 34 in total. None of the names were familiar at first, not until we started cross-referencing them back at the station. Then it started clicking. They weren't all from the Southwest. Some were from as far as Illinois or Oregon. But the timestamps all aligned, each disappearance falling within a 3-year stretch between 1994 and 1997. The same window the Trammels were bouncing between aliases. Same years as the photos on the canyon wall. Same years the cash withdrawals started appearing in offshore records. We took everything. Photos, paper logs, samples of dust and fabric and hair follicles caught in the vent filters. It would take months to process. But I already knew we'd never find fingerprints. Back in Austin, I spent the next 3 nights building a new wall. Steve helped. So did Evelyn. We stopped calling them cases. We started calling them names. Real names. Samira, Blake, Lucia, Jonah. Every one of them with a picture. Every one of them gone. Most of their families had never received a single call. No ransom, no remains. No confirmation of anything. Just silence. Now, at least, we had a place. A room, a pattern. A stretch of years that hadn't been random. The break came 2 days later. A field agent in Las Cruces reached out after seeing our internal bulletin. He'd been stationed in Alamogordo back in '96 and remembered a case involving a woman named Clara Levinson, who reported seeing a young girl pulled into a camper van by 2 adults at a roadside stop. She gave a full description: blonde woman, maybe late 30s, wearing what looked like church clothes. A man with a beard, buttoned-up shirt, calm voice. The girl was maybe 6. The woman called it in, gave the van's make, model, partial plate. The report was filed but never followed up. No one missing was reported that week. The case sat cold for decades. But when we pulled the original sketch from Levinson's statement and compared it side by side with a younger Laurel Trammell, it matched. Not a maybe. A match. The van description matched 2 registered in Texas under one of the shell companies we'd already tied to the Trammells. That was the first real confirmation we had that Laurel wasn't just along for the ride. She wasn't just using an alias. She was operating, coordinating, present. Steve said it first. If she's the one driving, who's the one choosing? It stopped me. Because the truth was, none of the victims were linked by location, ethnicity, gender, or family type. The only link was timing and proximity to the Trammells, which meant the pattern wasn't logistical. It was personal. Someone had a set of rules we hadn't cracked yet. I went back to the storage chest from the canyon. There was one document we hadn't made sense of yet, a child's drawing tucked between two file folders. Crayon on construction paper. It showed a house with no windows, a tree with no leaves, and 6 small figures drawn in a row, all holding hands. One of the figures had no head. I brought it to Evelyn. She enhanced the background with digital contrast. Hidden in the lower margin, too faint to read at first, was a penciled line. Just 4 words. Let her choose next. I didn't speak for a long time. Neither did Evelyn. We both just stared at the line like it might change shape if we looked hard enough. But it didn't. I walked back to my office, turned off the light, and sat with the board. 34 names. 1 note, 1 pattern. And for the first time, a question I couldn't file away. What if Laurel wasn't just choosing? What if she was being told who to choose and by whom? The next morning, Evelyn handed me a file she'd held overnight. It was a copy of a land transfer dated 1992, 5 acres outside Tucson, purchased under the name Joseph Vale. Same alias used to buy the Canyon property. But this parcel was never developed. Satellite showed a single foundation slab. No structure, no utilities, no record of demolition. We looked at each other, then back at the screen. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to movement. Like we weren't just chasing ghosts anymore. Like there was still a door left to knock on. The land parcel outside Tucson was even more unassuming than the Canyon lot. Just a flat stretch of sun-bleached scrub ringed by fencing that had long since collapsed in places. You wouldn't know a structure had ever stood there, if not for the poured concrete pad warped and stained with time, partially overgrown at the edges. Steve parked us under a lone Palo Verde tree. The air was still. No birds, no wind. I walked the perimeter while Evelyn worked the ground-penetrating radar. We didn't speak much, none of us did really by that point. The silence had become its own language. We'd learned how to wait, how to listen, how to read the quiet. What we found wasn't underground. It wasn't even hidden, just misfiled. Tucked into the far corner of the foundation, wedged behind a loose concrete pour and sealed with weatherproof caulk, was a small insulated lockbox. The kind used in HVAC work. Fireproof, airtight, hard to pick. Evelyn didn't want to open it there. She wrapped it twice, tagged the location, and we drove it back to the mobile lab that evening. She worked through dinner, pried it open just after midnight. I watched from the doorway, arms crossed, trying not to expect anything. But when she lifted the lid, and her breath caught just the smallest inhale, I knew it wasn't nothing. Inside were 2 items. A cassette tape marked 1992 LV in sharp black marker, and a manila envelope unsealed containing a stack of photographs and a typewritten page. Evelyn handed me the sheet first. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. Names, birth dates, locations, but no surnames, just initials. Every entry followed the same format: first name, age, place, last seen, and a single code in the final column. Sometimes it read harvested, other times just V. Some were blank. One name stood out: Elena, age 8, last seen in Phoenix code V2, reassigned. That name matched the missing child from the Levinson report in Alamogordo. The girl pulled into the van. The girl Laurel Trammell had been seen with. Her name had never been made public. It hadn't even been known to us until we'd cross-referenced the alias trail last week. But here it was, typed plainly in a list that predated the report. The photographs were worse. Not explicit, not graphic, just studied. Surveillance style. Kids at crosswalks, families at parks, all taken from a distance with a timestamp burned into the lower margin. Most had a red check mark in the corner. A few had an X. One, just one, had a note scribbled in pen along the edge. Too loud. Risk not worth it. The image showed a boy mid-scream reaching for someone just out of frame. I stared at it too long. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until Steve gently took the stack from me. We saved the tape for last. Evelyn wired it to a digitizer and played it through headphones first. She listened in full before speaking, then rewound, plugged in the monitor speakers, and let it run. The audio was old, hissed at the edges, but the voices were clear. 2 of them, a man and a woman. The woman sounded young. She spoke softly, almost reverently, as if reciting instructions. The man didn't speak at all for the first minute. When he did, it was with authority, not rage, not pleasure, just control. The conversation wasn't frantic, it was procedural. They discussed a date, a route, a method for separating a child from her parent. The child's name wasn't said, but the woman used a phrase that froze me. She said, "She's not ready for permanent placement. The elder wants more footage." Steve stopped the tape. Rewound 10 seconds. Played it again. "The elder wants more footage." I sat down, not out of shock, but because I knew that phrase. We'd seen it before. In the margin of a redacted customs intercept from 2003, an email fragment traced to one of the offshore shell companies used by the Trammels. It had been dismissed back then as jargon. Now it was a through line. Evelyn ran voice analysis. The female speaker wasn't Laurel, too high, too soft. The male voice, though, there was a 76% match with Richard Trammell's voice from a DMV recording filed under one of his earliest known identities, Alan Rusk. It wasn't confirmation, but it was close enough to draw a line, and once that line was drawn, everything else started lining up. I went back through every name from the bunker wall, every child with a missing year between 94 and 97. Then I pulled known lease agreements from the shell companies tied to Richard and Laurel. What emerged wasn't a chain, it was a lattice. Overlapping sites, overlapping timelines. But at the center of it all, like the hub of a wheel, was a recurring alias, J. Vale. Same one used to buy the Tucson parcel. Same one that appeared in the 2001 shipment manifest that was flagged in Yuma and never followed up. When I pulled the manifest, the declared contents were household fixtures. But the weight, 140 pounds, didn't match the description. The container was shipped from a logistics firm in Las Vegas to a nonprofit P.O. box in Georgia. The box had since dissolved. But the signature on the shipping order, Joseph Vale. I brought it all to the marshal's office the next morning. Evelyn and I sat in front of the task force director and laid out the findings. The tape, the photos, the shipment, the names. It took us an hour and 42 minutes to present. When we finished, no one spoke. Finally, the director asked, "Do you believe children are still alive?" I said, "I don't know, because I didn't." The photographs were dated, the locations defunct. The aliases were still active. Yes, but people who run things like this don't need to stay in one place. They don't need to keep the same names. They just need to be ahead. 1 step. 2 at most. That's all it takes. But I did believe one thing with absolute clarity: there were others. Not just Richard and Laurel. Not just their aliases. A network. Compartmentalized. Trained to blend in, then vanish. Harvest. Reassign. Document. Leave nothing behind but names and years and the residue of pattern. That afternoon, the Tucson site was declared a federal crime scene. Drones swept the area. Teams searched for subsurface disturbance. Nothing turned up. But that concrete slab, it was poured over rebar that matched a type sold only in South Korea between 1986 and 1990. Not standard for Arizona construction. Not local. It was imported. Deliberately. I went back to my apartment that night and took down the wall. Not to erase it, but to move it. I needed to start again. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere portable. I began building folders instead, digital and physical. One for each child. One for each alias. One for the voices on the tape. I didn't know what the next move would be, but I knew there was one. because there was one name left on the list we hadn't found a match for. One that didn't appear in any public database, any missing persons alert, or any family record. Just a first name and a year. Mara, 1993. Code initiated. No age. No location. No follow-up. Just that. And in the margin next to her name, a handwritten note in red ink. She remembers. It took nearly 4 weeks to trace the alias attached to Mara. The name alone wasn't enough. No last initial, no town, not even an age. Just a year, 1993, and that handwritten phrase, she remembers. That narrowed it down more than we thought. In the old ledger, the others were marked with variations on V or harvested. But Mara had something different. Initiated. We cross-referenced that with a few regional files from the mid-90s, flagged for group home transfers and unexplained placement terminations. Evelyn found it first a Department of Health and Human Services report from Nevada, 1995. Child file partially redacted, but the intake notes were still legible. Female. Estimated age 8 to 9. Brought in under the name Mara T. No social security number, no birth certificate. Admitted after being found in a public library just outside Carson City. No shoes, no bags. Said she had walked a very long way and had come to find the books they took. That wording stuck with us. It didn't mean much on its own, but when Evelyn dug deeper, she uncovered the intake worker's side notes typed in a separate memo. The girl had scars clean straight-lined low on her back and shoulder, and a faint mark across her jaw that looked like it had been sutured. But she didn't flinch when examined. Didn't respond to comfort either. The file read, "Child presents as dissociative. High verbal intelligence. Recalls procedures with disturbing neutrality. Insists she was not taken, but made for this." By the time Evelyn called the center, it had been defunct for over a decade. The building was now a flooring supply store. No forwarding files. No former staff on record. No one to confirm what became of her. We hit a wall until Evelyn ran a facial analysis against aged-up composites from long-term missing child reports. That's when something unexpected surfaced. A photo from a volunteer trauma survivors group in Phoenix, 2014. Not a law enforcement file, just an outreach newsletter. Group shot. 8 women. One of them looked like Mara. Same jawline, same faint scar. Older, late 20s by then, maybe early 30s. She wasn't identified in the caption, but the group was tied to a licensed counselor named Andrea Polk. Evelyn tracked her down. Retired, living in Flagstaff. We drove out the next day. Andrea answered the door before we even knocked. Said she'd seen our car crawl up the hill. Invited us in without asking who we were. The inside of her home was cluttered warm. She moved slowly with a cane, and she didn't offer coffee. Just motioned toward the chairs. She didn't need us to explain. Said she knew this day would come, though she'd expected it years ago. She called her by a different name, Ellie. Said she'd shown up to group 4 times always alone, always just listening. Never shared her last name. Didn't fill out the full form. But she talked once. The 3rd session. Told a story about a building with no windows and a mirror that could see through her eyes. Said she had a number, not a name. That the number was scratched into the floor under her bed, and that she learned to pretend not to remember because remembering got others hurt. Andrea paused then, looked toward the hallway like she was waiting for something. Then she said, "I think she knew exactly what she was doing. I think she came to see if she still existed. We asked if she had anything from her. Notes, a form, a contact." Andrea shook her head, then stood slowly and walked into another room. Came back with a plain folder rubber band around it. Inside was a single item, a drawing. Childlike, but not naive. Pencil on stiff paper. It showed a square room with a hatch in the floor and no door. In the center stood a girl facing a wall covered in what looked like rows of eyes. Underneath, in shaky block print, it read, "If I see you, You are real. We scanned the image, tagged it to the folder, and drove back in silence. That night I opened my own drawer, the one I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were printouts, some old, some recent, of unexplained group home incidents, disappearances with no records, kids marked as runaways who'd left behind no trail. I started cross-checking against the aliases from the ledgers. A pattern formed. Not just where they vanished, where they surfaced. Unverified placements. Religious relocation waivers. Unsanctioned guardianships approved through family courts with sealed records. It wasn't just Laurel and Richard. There were others running placement rings under shell ministries and non-profits. Churches with no buildings. Groups with no doctrine. Just names, permits, tax numbers, and children who passed through like shadows. Steve reached out that same week with an update from the cold case division. He'd flagged the Yuma manifest under a different task code, organized trafficking non-narcotic. Customs had never followed up, but the container had been logged again in Savannah, Georgia. It was never opened, just routed and shipped onward. Final destination, a wellness center in South Carolina that shut down in 2006 after one of its founders died. No charges were filed. The land was sold to a developer and later rezoned. But the logistics firm, still active, under a new name. Same registered agent, same bank routing number. The last shipment tied to them was 4 months ago to a property in upstate New York. I don't know why that part hit me harder than the others. Maybe because it meant it hadn't stopped. Or maybe because I knew with a kind of cold certainty that the name Mara had never belonged to one girl. It was a code, a role, a marker for memory. And whoever wrote "She remembers" in red ink knew what that meant. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. The next day, a plain white envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Postmarked Albuquerque. Inside was a single photograph. Recent. Printed from a phone. It showed the mural from the Carson City Library. A girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, stood in front of it, one hand on the painted book, the other holding a napkin. The words on the napkin were written in marker, barely legible in the grainy image. You're almost out west. I still don't know who sent the photograph. No fingerprints, no other note. Just that girl, maybe 10 or 11, standing in front of a mural meant to celebrate imagination. Her hand on the painted book. That napkin in her other hand. You're almost out west. The phrase had been written before once long ago in the margins of a file that should have never existed. And now it had surfaced again, not in an archive or a report, but in the hands of a living child. I stared at it for hours, trying to figure out if it was a warning or a message, or just someone's way of telling me the story hadn't ended. Maybe it never would. I kept it, tucked it into the same folder where I'd stored Mara's drawing, the shipping manifest, the folded page with the red circles. I don't look at them every day, but I don't put them away either. Not completely. Steve retired not long after the last container was traced. The investigation didn't go public. Too many threads still active. Too many people with influence who'd make sure it stayed quiet. But enough happened behind the scenes that some doors shut for good. Permits revoked. One arrest sealed. An offshore trust dissolved within a week. I never got to see who signed the order, but I recognized one of the surnames from the corner of a school newsletter in Parton Springs. That was enough. Evelyn stayed on, but in a different department. More oversight work now, less field time. We still talk. Not about the case, not directly, but once in a while she'll send me an article. Missing girl reunited with family. Unusual guardianship reversed in court. A survivor speaking out in an interview, face, blurred voice, altered. And I know what she's telling me without saying it. Some of them made it. Not all, not enough. But some. As for me, I never went back to the house. Not even once. I let the lease go, packed what I could carry, and moved closer to the edge of town where no one recognizes me by name. I take odd jobs. I drive. I read things twice before throwing them away. I still get letters. Sometimes they're blank. Sometimes they're not. One came last spring with no return address, just a single sheet of paper. On it, a line typed in the center. Memory is not the same as proof, but sometimes it's stronger. I didn't know what to do with that at first, but the more I sat with it, the more I understood. That's what they tried to erase. Not just identities or records or bodies, but memory. And the quiet fact that someone somewhere remembered you as real. I never found her, not truly. I don't know if she's still alive or if the girl in the photo was someone else, but I know someone wanted me to see her, and that matters. Because what I've learned is this: not every truth gets justice. Some just get told, quietly, carefully, with whatever pieces we're left holding. If this story meant something to you, if a name or a moment stayed with you, consider sharing it. Someone else might be waiting to know they're not the only one who remembers.